The sun was beginning to dip behind the tree-covered hills of the Pacific Northwest, casting long shadows over the reservation. A golden light bathed the landscape as the day cooled into a late summer evening. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and the smoke from cooking fires curling up from nearby homes. Laughter echoed faintly as families wrapped up their evening routines. Among them were the Yazzie family, a close-knit household of 5. 9-year-old Lena and her 12-year-old sister, Mariah, had begged their mother to let them go gather wildflowers near the riverbank, promising they wouldn't go far and would be back before dark. Their mother, reluctant but softened by their excitement, finally agreed after their older brother Daniel promised to go looking for them if they took too long. The girls skipped off hand in hand, their woven baskets bouncing against their sides, disappearing down a worn path that led to the woods just beyond the edge of the village. It was a place they knew well, often visiting with their grandfather to hear old stories or collect plants used in traditional medicine. But tonight, something felt different. The forest seemed quieter than usual, as if it were holding its breath. An hour passed, then another. The sun sank completely, and dusk crept over the land. When the girls hadn't returned, their mother grew anxious and sent Daniel to bring them home. He walked the trail calling their names, his voice swallowed by the thickening trees and fading light. There was no answer, no sign of them, only the chirr of insects and the rustle of leaves. Panic quickly set in. Within an hour, the family and neighbors had torches and lanterns, combing the area. But the forest held its silence. Not a footprint, not a ribbon, not even the baskets were found. By midnight, hope gave way to dread. Somewhere between the river and the tree line, the sisters had vanished without a trace. Morning broke heavy and gray, casting a dull light over the reservation. A low mist clung to the ground like a spirit unwilling to leave, wrapping the village in a shroud of quiet mourning. Word had spread quickly through the small community: Lena and Mariah were gone. The search resumed at dawn, this time with nearly every able-bodied person from the reservation joining in. Elders, cousins, neighbors, all formed lines and moved slowly through the forest, calling the girls' names, scanning every inch of underbrush, riverbank, and hollow. Some sang soft songs, asking the spirits of the land to guide them. Others carried eagle feathers and sage, whispering prayers as they searched. Daniel led one of the groups, his eyes red from a sleepless night, hands scratched from clawing through bramble. He retraced the path the girls would have taken a dozen times, whispering Mariah's name first, then Lena's, as if saying them aloud would make them reappear. He refused to rest, brushing off anyone who tried to stop him. Their mother sat near the fire pit outside their home, rocking back and forth silently, holding a blanket the girls had shared. Their father, a quiet man who rarely showed emotion, wandered through the trees like a ghost, eyes scanning the canopy as if expecting them to descend from above. By the third day, the local authorities arrived, county deputies unfamiliar with the land and indifferent to the family's cultural knowledge. They brought dogs and clipboards but seemed more concerned with writing reports than listening. They asked if the girls were unhappy at home. Had they run away? Had there been arguments? The question stung, implying blame, ignoring the sacred bond the girls had with their home and family. Daniel clenched his fists as one deputy casually remarked that, "Kids disappear sometimes." The tribal leaders met that evening around a sacred fire. The air was thick with smoke and sorrow. They spoke not only of the girls but of the pattern, of how missing native children were rarely searched for with urgency, of how their lives were treated as less. They vowed not to let this be forgotten. But as the days turned into weeks, the search waned. Hope dimmed. The forest had given no answers. And for the Yazzie family, a wound had opened that would never fully close. Years passed, but for Daniel Yazzie, time moved differently. While others around him aged into new routines and memories, he remained tethered to a single point in the past, the moment his sisters vanished into the forest. In 1950, just 5 years after that terrible summer, Daniel enlisted in the army, hoping distance and discipline might quiet the aching questions in his heart. He served with honor in Korea, but even in the chaos of war, he found himself staring into mist-covered hills that reminded him of home, wondering if his sisters had once stood somewhere just like it, looking back toward him. When he returned to the reservation in the mid-50s, not much had changed outwardly. Children played near the same dusty paths. Elders still gathered beneath the old cedar tree to share stories. But for Daniel, everything felt dimmer. His parents had aged quickly. His mother barely spoke of the girls anymore, as if saying their names would shatter something inside her. His father had taken to long walks alone, always toward the western woods, returning empty-handed but with eyes that had clearly searched. Daniel tried to move forward. He took a job with the tribal forestry department, working in the very woods that haunted him. He married briefly, but the weight he carried made him difficult to reach. His wife left quietly after 2 years, saying only that he lived with ghosts. By the time he was 40, Daniel had become known in the community as a solitary figure, respected, but distant. He kept meticulous records of the case, yellowed newspaper clippings, faded photographs, hand-drawn maps marked with circles and notes. He'd speak to elders who remembered the search, revisiting their stories over coffee or ceremony, always asking if they recalled something they hadn't shared before. Some thought he was obsessed. Others saw it as a kind of devotion. Every time a new body was found in the region, or a child went missing, Daniel would quietly reach out to authorities, checking for patterns. He studied weather records, regional maps, even military documents declassified in the late 70s. He wasn't searching only for answers anymore, he was searching for patterns, for meaning, for the one thread that might pull everything into clarity. To the outside world, the girls were a sad footnote in reservation history. But to Daniel, they were still alive in memory, frozen in that summer light, waiting for someone to finally hear their story. And he wasn't going to let them be forgotten. It was the winter of 1985, and snow had settled lightly over the reservation, quieting the landscape in a way that always made Daniel Yazzie feel both comforted and uneasy. He had just turned 57 and spent most days alone in his small house at the edge of the woods, sorting through old files and notes, the paper trail of a lifetime spent chasing shadows. The case of his sisters had long grown cold in the eyes of the outside world, but for Daniel, the silence was not an end, it was a waiting. Then, one cold afternoon, a letter arrived. It was unusual, not just because mail was rare for Daniel, but because the envelope was yellowed and thick, addressed in shaky handwriting that seemed almost unsure of itself. The return address was unfamiliar, a P.O. box in a small logging town nearly 100 miles north. Inside was a folded piece of lined paper, and when Daniel opened it, he immediately recognized the name scrawled at the bottom: Thomas Avery, a former logging contractor who had worked in the region during the 1940s. Daniel remembered him from when he was a teenager, quiet, blunt, and rarely seen in tribal gatherings. He hadn't thought of the man in decades. The letter was short, written with the tone of a man facing the end of his days. Thomas claimed he had seen something on the day the girls disappeared. He didn't explain why he hadn't come forward earlier, only that he couldn't die without telling someone. He wrote of being deep in the forest near an old access road when he spotted 2 uniformed men he described as wearing military-issue clothing, though there was no base nearby at the time. He saw them carrying something, bags or large packs, toward an area that had been marked for federal surveying. He recalled the look on one of the men's faces: tense, hurried, afraid. What caught Daniel's breath was a single sentence near the end of the letter: "I didn't know what I was looking at until later that week, when I heard about the missing girls. I think I saw them, or at least what happened to them. I was too much of a coward to speak then. But I know it was no accident, and no simple disappearance." Daniel sat frozen for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. The letter was dated nearly 3 months earlier. He called the P.O. box number listed but learned that Thomas Avery had passed away only weeks ago, quietly, without family. The message had arrived too late for questions, but just in time to light the fire again. That night, Daniel pulled out an old map he'd kept for 40 years and circled the area described in the letter. It was a place just outside the original search zone, dense, rugged, and overlooked because it had once been marked as private federal land. He hadn't searched there before. Now, he would. The forest was different now, older, thicker, more wild, but Daniel's feet moved as if guided by memory and instinct. Snow still lined the earth in thin patches, melting where the sun pierced the trees. He carried with him a battered canvas bag filled with maps, a compass, a flask of coffee, and the letter from Thomas Avery folded carefully in a plastic sleeve. It was early spring of 1985, and after weeks of studying the terrain and marking possible routes, Daniel finally set out for the area described in the confession. It took most of the morning to reach the old access road, nearly erased by decades of overgrowth. Tree roots had cracked through the worn gravel, and rusted wire fencing lay tangled along the brush like forgotten bones. He pushed deeper, following the contours of the land until he found a ridgeline that opened into a narrow gulch, a place that matched the description in Avery's letter almost exactly. Daniel paused. Something in the air felt heavy, charged. He crouched beside an ancient cedar tree, its trunk split with age and weather. There, half buried under a mat of moss and fallen pine needles, something glinted. He reached out slowly, brushing the debris away with shaking fingers. His heart pounded against his ribs as he uncovered a small, rusted object tangled in the roots. It was a necklace. A thin leather cord, mostly rotted, held a pendant of silver and turquoise, tarnished but unmistakable. It was shaped like a small bird, its wings outstretched, a common design in Navajo jewelry. Daniel knew it the moment he saw it. It had been Lena's, a birthday gift from their grandfather the year before she disappeared. She never took it off. He dropped to his knees. The forest stood silent around him as if listening. His breath caught in his throat, and he found himself whispering her name. The world blurred as tears welled in his eyes, not just from sorrow but from the realization that he wasn't crazy, not delusional, not clinging to nothing. This was real. This was proof. He sat there for a long time, cradling the pendant in his hand, trying to gather his thoughts. His mind flashed through the years of doubt, the pain of being told to let it go, the slow erosion of hope. And yet, here he was, holding a piece of his sister, left in a place no one was supposed to find. Eventually, he rose and began to mark the area. There were signs he hadn't noticed before, a shallow depression in the earth nearby, like a collapsed structure or a covered pit. The trees here grew oddly in a semicircle, and there was a faint metallic scent in the air that didn't belong to the forest. He realized this was more than just a place where something was dropped, it was a site. Something had happened here, something hidden, and Daniel was going to find out what. Daniel returned to the site over the following days, carefully documenting everything he saw. He took photographs, made sketches, and flagged anything that seemed unnatural: twisted metal partially buried in the dirt, an old length of cable, what looked like the rusted corner of a metal box protruding from beneath a tree root. The pendant had not been a fluke, it had been a breadcrumb. Something was buried here, something long forgotten or intentionally concealed. But this was no longer something he could face alone. He needed others to see what he was seeing. He needed witnesses. He contacted the tribal council first, showing them the necklace, the letter, and his findings. Most were skeptical at first. 40 years had passed, and too many old wounds had been left to scar over. But when the elders recognized the pendant and confirmed it as Lena's, the mood shifted. The weight of history seemed to fill the room. With their blessing, Daniel reached out to state authorities and filed an official request for an archaeological survey, citing the possible discovery of human remains on federally protected land. A week later, a team arrived, reluctant, procedural, but compelled by the evidence and the tribe's insistence. They brought ground-penetrating radar, shovels, and a forensic anthropologist. Daniel stood just behind them as they began the work, his arms crossed tightly, heart heavy with anticipation. The team worked slowly, methodically, clearing away years of moss and soil. Within hours, the radar began to pick up anomalies, irregular shapes just beneath the surface, metallic reflections, voids where Earth should have been solid. And then they struck something. It was the edge of a steel hatch, heavily corroded, buried beneath more than 3 feet of earth. It took nearly an hour to pry it open. Inside was a narrow shaft, leading down into darkness. The air that rose up was stale, tinged with chemicals and decay. The team descended carefully, their flashlights cutting thin beams into the murk. What they found made silence fall over the forest. A narrow chamber lay beneath, reinforced with old concrete and steel, its walls lined with decaying crates marked with faded government insignias. Some bore the stamp of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Others were unmarked entirely. In the center of the room, amid broken equipment and a collapsed support beam, were the skeletal remains of 2 small children, still partially clothed, their tiny shoes almost intact. No one spoke for a long time. When the remains were brought to the surface, Daniel sank to his knees, hands pressed to the frozen ground. There was no need for confirmation. He knew. Mariah and Lena had been found. The anthropologist would later say that the condition of the remains and the surrounding evidence suggested they hadn't died immediately. That they might have been kept here, hidden, possibly for days. The crates contained experimental chemical containers, long expired, and documents too decayed to read. Whatever had happened in this place, it had been covered up, sealed away beneath layers of secrecy and soil. And it had been forgotten, until now. Daniel watched as the authorities carried the remains away with an eerie mix of grief and vindication in his chest. He had not been wrong. His sisters had not simply vanished. They had been taken, hidden, sacrificed for something no one had dared to speak of. Now, the world would have to listen. The discovery sent shockwaves beyond the reservation. Word spread quickly through tribal networks, local media, and eventually national outlets. Headlines ranged from respectful to sensational. Missing Native sisters found after 40 years, secret military facility unearthed in remote forest, government silence questioned in decades-old disappearance. But while reporters scrambled for interviews and images, the people closest to the tragedy, the Yazzie family and their community, gathered quietly to brace for what came next. A formal press conference was scheduled within the week, held at a nearby county courthouse. It was the first time in decades that Daniel stood before so many cameras, and he did so not for attention, but because it was time the truth had a witness. He wore a ribbon shirt sewn by his mother years ago and held a photograph of Mariah and Lena, their faces bright with childhood joy, frozen forever in a time before shadows fell over their lives. To his right stood members of the tribal council, and to his left, the forensic team leader who had overseen the excavation. A military representative arrived late, escorted by a federal liaison. His face was blank, his words measured and vague. He expressed deep regret for the historic oversight and offered condolences to the Yazzie family. He referenced an unauthorized operation during the 1940s tied to experimental testing that had since been disbanded. He avoided naming those involved. He offered no direct acknowledgement of a cover-up. Daniel stood silently during the speech, his face unreadable, the photograph trembling slightly in his hand. When it was his turn to speak, he did not shout or accuse. Instead, he told the story of two sisters who had loved wildflowers and sang to each other when they thought no one was listening. He spoke of the years spent searching, of the weight of doubt, and of the moment he knew he had held a piece of Lena in his hand again. He said their names aloud. Not once, but 3 times. Lena, Mariah, Lena, so that no one would forget. Later that week, a tribal council meeting was held in the community center, packed with elders, activists, and young people who had only ever heard the story in fragments. Emotions were raw, grief, anger, but also pride. The community had stood by Daniel when no one else would. Now, they stood together demanding more than an apology. They demanded investigation, reparations, and most of all, recognition. Not just for the Yazzie sisters, but for the many Native children who had gone missing over the decades and never been searched for with this level of urgency. Petitions were drafted, and a formal resolution was sent to state and federal governments calling for a full inquiry. Daniel, though exhausted, agreed to testify if it came to it. Not for vengeance, but for truth. He didn't want the story to end with his sisters being found. He wanted it to be the beginning of something larger. That evening, as the stars came out over the hills, fires burned in front yards across the reservation. People sang old songs and shared memories of the girls. And Daniel, sitting near the warmth of the flame, finally allowed himself a breath he hadn't taken in 40 years. Not because the pain was gone, but because it had finally been heard. A year had passed since the discovery, but for Daniel Yazzie, time moved in a way that no longer obeyed clocks or calendars. He stood on a quiet ridge overlooking the valley where his sisters had once run barefoot through tall grasses, their laughter echoing between the trees. The seasons had turned again, and spring returned with its usual promise of rebirth. Wildflowers bloomed along the edges of the forest, bluebells, fireweed, Indian paintbrush. It was the same trail the girls had taken on their final walk, now marked with small wooden signs bearing their names. The community had transformed the area into a sacred remembrance site. A place for healing. A place for truth. The investigation into the hidden facility had opened more doors than anyone had expected. Files were declassified, some willingly, others pried loose by legal action and public pressure. The more they uncovered, the more haunting the picture became. In the 1940s, a joint military contracted research initiative had been quietly testing chemical dispersal methods in remote regions, projects buried under vague language and coded terminology. The forest surrounding the reservation had been labeled a zone of low population density, chosen specifically for its seclusion. Records did not name Lena or Mariah, but handwritten notes referenced incidental exposure, unauthorized contact, and containment measures. There were no charges filed, no names released, no justice in the way most people imagined it. But there was something else, something more lasting. The voices of Native communities across the country grew louder. What had happened to Lena and Mariah wasn't isolated. Their story became part of a broader truth, part of a long, painful history that could no longer be buried. Daniel had become a symbol, reluctantly, quietly, for persistence, for the sacred act of remembering. That spring, a memorial was held on the reservation. Hundreds came, family, neighbors, tribal members, and strangers who had been moved by the story. A white stone marker was placed near the tree line where the girls had last been seen. Their names were etched into the granite, framed by the image of a bird in flight, just like the pendant Lena once wore. A soft wind passed through as Daniel stood beside the marker, eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. He spoke to them, not to ghosts, but to his sisters, as if they were near, listening. "I found you," he whispered. "You're home now." In the following months, Daniel continued his work, helping families search for missing relatives, speaking quietly at gatherings, lending what knowledge he could. He never sought attention. His heart had been forged in silence, in the long, slow ache of waiting. But he had learned something sacred in that silence, that truth endures. That love, when held long enough, becomes a force that can move mountains and open sealed doors. And though the years had taken much from him, they had given him this: a final answer, a place to grieve, and a future where his sisters' names would never again be lost in the dark.